Israel was in Egypt's land. Let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We have a packed chapter here full with big ideas about slavery in the South, catching us up on what's going on in our country with slavery in that antebellum era. So let's talk about the big ideas first before we get into the nitty and gritty details. So first off, okay, the South here, we know is very different from the North. We have spent a lot of time in the North thus far talking about, market revolution, industrial revolution, factory system, etc. But about the South, we've mentioned slavery, we mentioned that it's going on, but we're really going to focus on this chapter, what's going on with slavery, specifically in the South, and how, Southern society kind of operates a little bit more detailed. We know that the issue of heading out west is going to come up with some big issues as far as slavery that we're going to talk more about in the end of this chapter and also chapter 13. States' rights, nullification, and those stereotypes, okay, are going to provide the South to basically argue that the idea of slavery is a positive good, which is kind of silly, but this is like their way of trying to rationalize, if you will, the idea of slavery. We're going to talk about how slaves are going to overtly and covertly resist slavery, how to do that, and then we're also going to talk about the abolitionists, who they are, and exactly what they do. So talk about and kind of press the rewind button here on slavery, and I want you to go all the way back to your summer work and think about one of the things that I stressed in, I believe it was our first few chapters, maybe chapter 3, if you will, was a turning point for why we start to become more of a slave-based society in the 13 colonies. And that brings us all the way back to the story of Jamestown. And there was a Bacon's Rebellion, if you remember. And in Bacon's Rebellion, the reason this was a turning point was because Nathaniel Bacon, who was rebelling against Governor Berkeley because of the way that the governor was not reacting or taking action against the natives who were attacking the colonists, Nathaniel Bacon rises up, and most of his followers were indentured servants. And after the rebellion is over, people started to say, you know what, we don't really want these indentured servants becoming a threat to our society. And so they stopped using indentured servants and we started to move toward African chattel slavery. So that was the big turning point. If I'm a grader and I'm reading your essay on slavery and you're talking all about the antebellum era and the compromises, etc., but your essay begins talking about the reason why slavery becomes so popular in our country, and you mentioned the Bacon's Rebellion story. I mean, that's brilliant, okay? A reader is really going to be awed if you were to mention something like that. Fast forward a little bit, the idea of slavery is protected by the Constitution. Many of us are not aware of that. The Constitution, remember, when they were trying to ratify the Constitution, they needed the support of all of the 13 colonies, future 13 states, and so they couldn't alienate the South and say, no, slavery is not cool. So they did allow slavery. Our forefathers did believe at that time that slavery was on its way out, and so they were okay with protecting it in the Constitution. Now, the Three-Fifths Compromise, if you remember, this had to do with representation in Congress. 3/5 of a state's slaves would be counted as population. This was necessary in the House of Representatives because those southern states would get more representatives then. The slave trade does end in 1808, but actually slavery explodes figuratively in our country because of that invention. Think about that invention in 1793. We'll mention that in a few moments. There is a Fugitive Slave Act, okay, and it's going to be reinforced in 1850, which we'll talk about next week. But there's a Fugitive Slave Act that says if a slave runs away, a slave owner has the ability to go and get them. Problem is, they just can't go to the north. But we'll come back to that eventually. So there you go. That's what slavery looks like in the Constitution. Cool. Awesome. Moving on. Slavery population in 1790, as you can see, was dying out, okay, like we were talking about before. Fast forward a little bit to the Articles of Confederation. Slavery was in fact banned by the Northwest Ordinance. Okay, it was one of those components of that success, if you will, of the Articles of Confederation. So slavery was an issue early on. Forward a couple weeks ago, 1820, Henry Clay's Missouri Compromise talked about slavery, right? The issue of Missouri becoming a state. It was going to be a slave state, but upset the balance in Congress of slave and free states. Henry Clay says, okay, Missouri, you're in as slave to keep the balance. Maine, you're in as a free state. And then he draws the 3630 line. And he says everything above this line from here on out in the Louisiana Territory will be free, and everything below it will be slave. Remember, we don't have claims to Texas, California, and all that stuff just yet. That's next week. And then here you go. The reason for that, the internal slave trade to really explode in our country, even though the slave trade was over, the internal slave trade within our country explodes because of the invention by Eli Whitney. Okay, and that was the cotton gin. Okay, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. And cotton becomes king in the South, right? Cotton becomes the main export in the South, and really becomes a staple not only in Southern economy but also in our overall economy in the U.S. Okay. Yeah, this is just what a life in the day of a day in the life, I should say, of what a plantation looks like. You can see the slaves in the plantation working in the fields. This is more picture there. You see on the bottom left-hand side on the plants, and then it's picked, and then on the right-hand side, the bottom right, the slaves are putting the cotton through the cotton gin. You can see cotton becomes extremely popular in our country, but also the world. The United States by 1860 is the world producer in cotton. And as we know, with cotton increase in production, you're also going to see an increase in our slaves here in America. So by 1820, okay, you can see where cotton is starting to become very, very popular in the South. And then by 1860, you can see dominating all those southern countries, the deep South, if you will. Okay. But as we said, also goes up slavery. And in 1790, about 600,000 slaves in America, which really isn't a lot. Obviously, it is, but it's really not a lot compared to the 4 million that we're going to see by 1860, the beginning of the Civil War. So just incredible. All right, even though we're not taking slaves from Africa anymore, our internal slave trade is just bonkers. And you can see slavery right here, and what it looks like in our country in those early 1820s. And then by the time of 1860, the beginning of the Civil War, you can just see how slavery has expanded and how people are trying to flee slavery. Okay, and that's those lines are. We'll talk about those lines in a moment. All right, so you just see like typical mansion. A lot of these plantation houses are still down there in the South today. We will get to more of these compromises later, but you should recognize the Missouri Compromise, but we will talk more about those others coming up. And cotton gin, got it. Okay, Eli Whitney, thank you so much for having such a huge impact on slavery. Okay, now the antebellum South. You should be able to recognize the word, sorry about that, the word antebellum. Antebellum means Civil War era. So if you want to sound super smart in your writing, you should really be able to use that term and recognize it also. King cotton, we mentioned that already, becomes the main export of the Southern economy and really drives our overall American economy. We know the South has a lack of industry. Okay, that's where the North is. And the money that's invested in slave labor, it's just so immense, right? And that's really one of the reasons why the South is going to really fight to the death when it comes to the Civil War for that way of life and slavery, because there's just so much invested in slave labor, and to give it up is really really a big deal for them. But what's interesting is, we talk about them fighting to the death about this, but only 25% of Southern population actually owned slaves, which is kind of interesting to think about because that's only a fourth. You would think that almost everybody owns slaves, right? We generalize. We kind of think that in our minds, everybody who owned land in the South must have owned slaves, but it's not true. Only about a quarter of them did, which is interesting. So then why is it that they're supporting this institution of slavery if not everybody owns slaves? 75% of the population doesn't own slaves. Well, two reasons. One, because of racism, okay? And even though you may not own slaves, it doesn't mean you're a supporter of, civil rights and things like that. And you want slaves to stay in that, low socioeconomic status. And then there's also the idea that you too want to become rich and powerful one day, and one of those signs of being rich and powerful is owning land and also slaves. So you want slavery to stick around, okay? And those are the two reasons why they do support slavery if they don't own slaves. Southern politics is really dominated by the few wealthy elite. Sometimes, you have plantation owners that are going to be dominating politics. If they're not the ones in office, they're the ones that are kind of persuading the politicians through money, which is unfortunate. I'd like that. I would love to say that today that doesn't happen, but unfortunately, some politicians are still persuaded by money. And there's four major groups that make up Southern society. Okay, at the very top, we know there's Southern plantation owners. These are the guys that own 100 plus slaves. Slave holders are, small slaveholders are people that own, under 10 slaves. Okay, if you own maybe a couple, you're a small slaveholder. And those first two groups make up your 25% of the population, which means the other 75% of the population falls under groups 3 and 4, which are the yeoman farmers, which you remember from your homework, are your typical farmers who are, subsistence farming. Basically, they're manning the land and usually just producing enough for their family, maybe a little bit more for their community. And then people, the pine barrens, who are kind of like your people who aren't farmers. There, have other trades. Okay, now very different than the North. We know the North is all about industry, and we talked about who's working in those factories. We had immigrants, women, children, but now children are trying to be removed from the factories and be put into schools because of Horace Mann, as we talked about last week, and school reform. Okay, is it possible to be a free black in the South during this time? And the answer is surprisingly yes. Okay, does it mean that you are able to enjoy all the freedoms of a free white person? Absolutely not. Even though there are about roughly 250,000 freed African Americans in the South, there are still many restrictions on the free population there. Things like, not being able to own pieces of land and vote and be a citizen and serve as a politician. Those are given no-nos. Slaves, forget about it. They basically aren't allowed to do anything on their own, leave the property. They need permission from their master to pretty much do anything. They're not allowed to be literate, things like that. You can see Southern population as far as split up between whites and slaves. As you go deeper south, you're going to see the percentages of slaves be even greater in some cases, like South Carolina and Mississippi, where the slave population is more than the white population. So just kind of crazy to think about. So as mentioned in the South, there is, roughly 250,000 freed African Americans and, many restrictions on their daily life. We'll get to who Nat Turner is in a little bit. But there's also obviously a population in the North where you don't have slaves and you have about roughly the same number of freed blacks in the North and 250,000. But there's a lot of racial tension in the North. Just because the North doesn't have slavery doesn't mean that, if you're a freed African American, you don't experience, racism, for example. But there's a lot of racial tension, not only amongst African Americans and whites, but also the immigrants, okay, that are in the factories as well, looking for those low skilled jobs. And you're going to see some race riots later on when we start talking about wars and things like that. There's going to be race riots, and there's a lot of tension in the major cities like New York, Chicago, for example, with the competition for low skilled jobs. Now, speaking of slavery and chattel slavery, there's a book that is going to be published in 1852 by Miss Harriet Beecher Stowe, who is actually the daughter of Lyman Beecher. That name should be recognizable. He was the American Temperance Society founder. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, is a fictional story in which Uncle Tom, who is a slave, he has three owners in this book. Owner number one's pretty good to him, but then owner number one gets old and runs into money issues, has to sell Tom to owner number two. Owner number two is pretty much a trader. He really doesn't hold on to slaves too long, and he sells Tom in a very short manner of time, doesn't care about him, and sells him to owner number three. And owner number three is ultimately going to be the one that kind of kills Tom and, kills him to death and all that stuff and whips him, which is not cool. But this fictional story, even though it was, like I said, fictional, it doesn't mean that things like this didn't happen. And Northerners, you have to remember, a lot of Northerners, regular people, they have no idea what slavery looks like, right? They're not traveling outside of their community, sometimes their entire lives. And when they read a book like this, they're angered, they're surprised, they're shocked that this is what slavery looks like. And so this is really going to enrage a lot of Northerners and cause a lot of people to become abolitionists on the road to the Civil War because they're so taken back by this book and what it had to say about slavery. Now, talking resistance to slavery, there are a lot of ways to resist slavery. Work slower, be negligent, to break equipment, or you could run away through the Underground Railroad, which remember is neither a railroad nor underground. Thank you. Um, and then, or you can be more violent and you can revolt. Okay, and here's a couple of revolts. This one, the first one, the Stone Hill Rebellion. We've talked about this already a long time ago in the beginning of the year. This was a slave revolt in South Carolina, and the slaves try to make it to Florida in order to run away. They don't make it. They are caught. It's unsuccessful, and ultimately the result is going to be stricter slave codes, which is the same effect you're going to see from Denmark Vesey's rebellion in South Carolina 1822 and Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831. Doesn't matter which rebellion you're talking about, all three result in stricter slave codes, okay, which is obviously not good. Now, when I say slave codes, this means your rules, your laws in which a slave has to follow, things like not being allowed to read or write, not being allowed to leave the property, etc. And so those are called slave codes. Also, you can call them black codes, okay? We usually use black codes, though, post-Civil War. Slave patrols, okay, just so you're aware, these are patrols of, sometimes whites, sometimes other slaves who are, their job is to make sure that slaves do not run away off the property and also to make sure that they're, working during the day. Now, the Underground Railroad, we talked about this in the last chapter. We said neither underground nor a railroad, but instead an underground or secretive system in which slaves were able to escape to the north. Your conductor, air quotes there, if you will, Harriet Tubman, very important lady. She's the one who was born a slave, and she makes her escape, and then she goes back numerous times into the South to help other slaves reach their freedom, which is just remarkable. She put her life in danger so many times. Another interesting story here, Henry the Box Brown shipped himself in 1848 from Virginia to Philadelphia in a box, hence why his nickname is Box, and then he winds up writing a book about it in 1851. So pretty remarkable, pretty crazy, but these are the extents in which people would go to escape slavery, and obviously, okay, you would. Okay, let's talk about the rest of this chapter here with slavery. We're almost done with this part. So here we go. African American culture, okay, was very unique. Remember, we had a little bit of a blending going on here with African American cultures because technically, what you've had is all these different African tribes that were brought over to the Americas and they're kind of blending together. Plus, they're being a little bit more Americanized. And so, African American culture becomes very unique and very different than any other that we've seen in history. And especially when you talk about religion, the main religions were very unique as well, and they weren't exactly just straight up Protestants. You do see Baptist and Methodist Church become the more popular churches amongst Black Christians, and this is because of the style of preaching. Okay, the more emotional and more singing. Okay, involving in the preaching, and again drawing on more of their traditions going back to Africa. And if you've ever watched anything or read anything about slavery, you've seen or heard at least, just like the song that was playing in the beginning of this lecture, these songs that were kind of sung on the fields by these slaves. And that's kind of why Baptists and Methodists become a popular sect of Catholicism for African Americans. The abolition movement itself, to run down the other groups involved in the abolitionist movement. Remember, an abolitionist is somebody who wants to abolish or get rid of slavery. The Quakers were one of the earliest opponents to this. When we talk about the Quakers in Pennsylvania all the way back in the 13 colonies, they right then and there said no slavery, okay, which was very unique and very different and a very early time for people to come out and say that. Fast forward during James Monroe's presidency, the American Colonialization Society, you may remember that in passing. That was, we set up a society in Liberia, which is back in Africa, also referred to as Monrovia, named after James Monroe, which we said, okay, we're going to send these freed slaves back to Africa. It was kind of a failed experiment because, like I said before, these Africans were so Americanized by this time that it was, a very strange, culture you're sending them back into. So it didn't really work. David Walker writes a book, Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, where he kind of inspires that idea of violent uprisings, where a Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey get the idea to do that, if you will. And so that was, not a unique approach, but just someone to associate with this violent uprising. William Lloyd Garrison is a white abolitionist where he has a newspaper called The Liberator and really speaks out against emancipation and about slavery and calls for emancipation, I should really say, and a very outspoken white abolitionist, whereas most abolitionists we think and hear about most of the time are black abolitionists, like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. Okay, two people who were born slaves and escaped, to their freedom in the North. And Frederick Douglass, in particular, becomes a very prominent speaker and writer amongst all of society, whites and blacks, where he will be invited to the White House numerous times for debates and discussions with guys like Lincoln, etc. Frederick Douglass, a very big part of political life later on, and the Liberty Party in 1840. Okay, pretty obvious what their platform is going to be. That's a third political party. We're not going to see a president become a Liberty Party member, if you will. And the Liberty Party, their message is straight up, to promote freedom. Okay, but again, we're not going to see a Liberty Party president. So Southern reaction to the issue of slavery, obviously very different all throughout. Um, one of the things they do in the South is they're just so fed up with talking about slavery in Congress is they pass the gag resolution. And in your reading, you heard about this, where they don't want to talk about it. They literally ban it from talking in Congress from 1836 to 1844, and you're not allowed to bring it up as a petition in Congress, which is absurd because it's obviously starting to dominate politics as we get closer and closer to that Civil War time. But eventually repealed by John Quincy Adams. That's right, he's still around in 1844. We know about slaves not being allowed to be literate. We talked about slave codes. We talked about Nat Turner. Um, Anti-slavery messages banned from Southern Mail. Bizarre. Pro-slavery argument by George Fitzhugh, where I kind of mentioned this already quite a few times already, where George Fitzhugh says, slaves are family, and they're clothed and they're fed by these masters, whereas the North, your factory workers, they're wage slaves. They're not treated like family. They're not given, a shelter and clothing and all this stuff, which is, obviously ridiculous. So again, their rationalization as to why slavery should be considered a good thing. But obviously, they're looking down upon these people as an inferior people, which is just sad. All right, so that brings us to the last part of the chapter, and it has to do with switching gears a little bit from slavery to 1840. We last left off with Martin Van Buren as president, and that brings us to 1840, where we have the Whigs choosing William Henry Harrison. Remember, the Whigs are our new Federalists, if you will. Okay, remember the Federalists died out, and then because of Andrew Jackson, we saw a split between the Democrats and the Whigs, or what they called the National Republicans back then. So William Henry Harrison, he's been around. He was one of the guys from the War of 1812 who helped win the Battle of Tippecanoe. Okay, the War of 1812. So his slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. John Tyler being his vice president. Now, Tyler being a former Democrat is interesting because William Henry Harrison dies. Okay, 32 days in presidency, the shortest presidency of all of our presidents. And he dies, which means John Tyler is the new president. But even though Harrison was a Whig, and now John Tyler is president, he's supposed to be a Whig. Many of his policies and many of his, thinking is going to reflect that of the Democrats. So interesting. So what about Tyler? What do we know about Tyler? What goes down in his presidency? Tyler, he is, like I said, although he's a Whig, he's going to have many Democrat beliefs. He's going to block a lot of the Whig Party beliefs, like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Um, but the biggest thing to talk about with Tyler is the story about Texas. And Tyler wanted Texas. He wanted Texas to become part of the United States, and Congress does not. So that leads us to talk about this story about Texas. So what's Texas? Texas was once upon a time owned by Mexico, which once upon a time is owned by Spain. And as you talked about last year, hopefully, that Mexico gains its independence from Spain. And once they do that, Mexico says, hey, listen, Texas is a great land, a great area. And Americans, if you want to come to Texas, you only have to follow three laws, okay? Three rules for Americans to live in Texas. Become a Mexico citizen, obey our laws, and become Roman Catholic. Awesome. That's it. Only three rules in order for Americans to stay in Texas. Problem is, Americans are Protestant. Americans don't want to listen to laws. They believe that they're American, and they don't want to become a Mexican citizen. That's going to lead to some issues. Okay, so we'll see that in a second. So like I said before, Mexico wins its independence from Spain, and a lot of Mexicans welcomed in U.S. settlers because U.S. settlers brought money. So one of the guys that really becomes popular there, Stephen Austin, he grants permission to American settlers, so a lot of people come. Like I said, they bring wealth and money and prosperity, so that's why you see a lot of Americans flooding to Texas. There is a lot of land to be had, and you're going to see, as you can see in that last bullet there, in 1823, 300 settlers, American settlers in 1823 to 50,000 by 1836, and they're going to outnumber the Mexican Texans, or what we call Tejanos. Yes, thank you for my wonderful accent. But like I said, those three rules were supposed to be in effect for Americans if they wanted to live in Mexico. And like I said, they did none of these, which is no good, no bueno. So, this is going to have a couple of issues now because these Americans, or what we're going to call Texans, these Texans did not want to follow those rules. And Mexico says, okay, we have to do something about this. Okay, we're going to stop allowing Americans coming into Texas because these Americans or these Texans, they're not following the rules. Okay, they're not becoming Roman Catholic, they're not obeying Mexican law, and um, they're not becoming Mexican citizens. Okay, so Mexico says in 1830, stop. Okay, no more Americans. If you do, okay, we're going to have to use force to enforce the laws. So, okay, that leads to a couple of conflicts here. The Mexican general and then later on dictator, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, okay, he's kind of like a brutal dictator. He does not want any of this unrest. He's very brutal. The word dictator obviously can just tell you the message of who he is and what he's all about. He's not into all this, this fighting and all of this disobeying on the Texans' part. So a lot of Tejanos are upset about the Americans disobeying the rules. They're bringing in slaves. Mexico had abolished slavery. They don't want them, and these Americans and these Texans are bringing in slaves. So it's just a mess. They really need order, and Santa Anna is going to inflict that discipline that really was needed. So I talked about the Tejanos, I talked about who they are, and I talked about how they're unhappy with these Texans. So what happens is it really boils down to a place, and it's called the Alamo. And the Alamo is an old Spanish mission. And the Alamo was it was occupied by these, Tejanos, and then the Americans throw them out. Okay, the Texans throw them out, and they take hold of the Alamo, the old Spanish mission. Well, here comes General Lopez de Santa Anna. He does not want this. And so he comes in and he slaughters Americans. Okay, there's 190 Texans, which isn't a lot, up against 6,000 Mexican soldiers. They don't stand a chance. Now, some of the people that were on the other slide, 2 slides ago, like William Travis, for example, okay, he was at this fight. He's going to wind up dying. He refuses to surrender his people. The Alamo, needless to say, is taken back by force by Santa Anna. And it leads to this war cry of remember the Alamo, okay? Where, remember the Americans that died at the Alamo, remember, and we should get revenge on these guys, which is then going to lead to that revenge, and people want that revenge. So after those Americans are slaughtered, you're going to see Sam Houston go after Santa Anna, and he will go after Santa Anna. He gets Santa Anna. He forces him to relinquish Texas, temporarily, if you will, and so Texas is supposed to be, free of Santa Anna. Now, this is interesting because Texas says we're free, we're no longer part of Mexico. Santa Anna relinquishes us, and Texas says Mexico doesn't want us. The United States doesn't want anything to do with us. And you say, wait, why doesn't the United States want anything to do with us? Well, because remember, what's the issue of adding on a new state? The issue of slavery. And it's pretty clear, right? If there's already slaves in Texas, what kind of state it would become? So America said, no, we don't want anything to do with it. Okay, we don't want to add on this new territory. And so Texas says, if nobody wants us, well then we're just going to become our own country. And Texas wins independence. Texas becomes its own country. They're called the Lone Star Republic, and their flag is pretty much exactly like ours, except they have one star. They have one white stripe and one red stripe. Okay, and they're the Lone Star Republic today. That's their state nickname. So, that's kind of the story of Texas for now. Texas will complete that whole story of Texas and how it gets annexed next week when we talk about the Mexican-American War, because Texas for now is kind of up in the air, right? The issue of slavery is just kind of postponing that annexation of Texas. So we'll have to complete that story of Texas next week. All right, but eventually we know Texas will be annexed to the United States, and it will become a state and become a slave state. All right, and that president, who we'll talk way more about next week, is James Polk. All right, and he's the president who actually gets Texas to be annexed. All right, but technically Tyler was the one who kind of pushed for it, even though he's not the president that it happens under. Okay, but we'll talk, like I said, more about that next week. All right, ladies and gentlemen, hope this was helpful. If it was helpful, just give me a like or subscribe. Hope you have a wonderful day and be safe. Peace out.